Sounds all right, doesn't it? But by the time they were eating normally, their fat stores were actually 70% higher than they had been at the start of the study. So 60 years ago, we had pretty good evidence that when you put people on a calorie-restricted, low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, it messes them up, okay, in a major way. And we've been recommending that diet ever since. So let's have a little look at this, and think about why it is that this thing really can't work for people. And the first thing that I want to talk about is this concept that fat is fattening, okay? So I know this sounds like a glib question, and I can be a bit glib from time to time. Why do we believe that fat is fattening? Okay, so I've heard both the right answers there, okay? One of which is it's got more calories than carbohydrate or protein, about twice as many per gram, all right? The other thing, it's called fat, all right? So we have a branding issue with it, all right? As you would say in the States. Okay. But the thing is really, is it fattening? Well, there's quite a lot of epidemiological... I almost took this point out when I was listening to Denise earlier, because epidemiology is really a load of rubbish, in my view. And I write a blog fairly regularly, not this week maybe, but fairly regularly I write a blog, and I hardly ever write about epidemiological evidence, okay, because I just think there's so little we can learn from it. But as it happens, there's quite a lot of studies that don't show a correlation between the amount of fat that people eat and their weight, okay? But more importantly than that, what happens when people go on low-fat diets? That's the real test of low fat, and here's what happens. Not very much good happens. That's what really happens. This was summarized in a form of what's called a meta-analysis by a group of researchers called the Cochrane Collaboration, who took all the kind of low-fat studies where they were comparing low fat with diets that might be restricted in calories but weren't explicitly low in fat. And what they found was the low-fat diets underperformed the other sorts of diets consistently, and at the end of 18 months of low-fat eating, there was a net gain in weight overall. Okay. Now, this study actually was withdrawn 3 or 4 years later, and I asked the Cochrane Collaboration why it had been withdrawn. I was interested. Why would you take it? And the answer that I was given was, well, they had no plans to update the data, so now they're pretending it didn't happen. Well, they didn't say that, but that's what it appears to be. Okay, so look, the bottom line is this, is that it appears that, low-fat diets can't really work, to be perfectly frank. And so all I would say is this, is that, this is a major theme that people have in their heads, that fat is fattening, that if they eat a low-fat diet, then they're destined to lose weight. And actually, we have a pretty good idea it doesn't really work that way. So why doesn't it work that way? Well, you could look at other things, that cause fat deposition in the body. Forget about calories, which is what I often tell my patients. Forget about calories. Forget them. Concentrate on this. What would cause more fat to get in fat cells? Okay, what does that? Well, this is nuanced. It's kind of complex. I'm not saying it's just one thing, but one part of this puzzle is insulin. So, we have fat floating around the bloodstream, often in the form of what are called triglycerides, okay? When they come along to a fat cell, they can't get in, right? Now, all of you, from what I could see from yesterday, I've read Gary Taub's book, so you'll know this, okay? But just so we go through this, to get into the fat cells, triglycerides need to be deassembled, and one thing that does that is a hormone called lipoprotein lipase, okay? Well, insulin actually enhances that hormone that allows more potential for fat to get into fat cells. Once they're there, to fix them, they have to be made into triglycerides again. So one way you can do that is to take 3 fats along with something called glycerol. Glycerol comes from what? It actually comes from glucose, and insulin facilitates glucose transport into cells. Also, to get out again, it needs to be disassembled, right? So to be disassembled, you need the action of a hormone called hormone-sensitive lipase, and that is inhibited by insulin. So if you want the skinny on this, basically fat facilitates the uptake of fat into fat cells and stops it getting out, basically. So you could argue it is probably overall a bit fattening, right? And the other thing that it does is actually stimulate production of fat in the liver. Okay, so we probably don't want a huge amount of insulin. And the fact of the matter is that, as you all know, carbohydrates drive insulin secretion, some more than, if you eat a bowl of spinach, it's not going to do much. It's basically carbohydrate, isn't it? Some water. But, if you eat something like a baked potato, that's going to be generally more problematic. There's more food there, and it's generally more disruptive. Insulin also is triggered by protein, okay? Not as much as carbohydrate overall, but that does happen. We'll talk about that again in a moment. And then we've got fat. Fat doesn't really cause much insulin secretion, okay, if any at all. Okay, so you could argue, if you look at it this way, if insulin is important in fat production, maybe the diet should be actually quite rich in fat, quite low in carbohydrates, particularly those that disrupt blood sugar, and a bit of protein there, probably not too bad. But let's go on from here and look at what happens when people eat high carb. They make a lot of sugar in the bloodstream as a result of that. They're going to make a lot of insulin, and then what can happen? They can become what?
Metabolically deranged.
Metabolically deranged, yes, wasn't what I had in my head, but they can become a bit insulin resistant, can't they, right? So insulin isn't really doing its job. So what happens? Blood sugar levels tend to be on the high side. That can be damaging to the body, by the way. We'll look at that again in a moment. And then another thing that can happen is that glucose is not effectively being transported into the cells, as other fuels may not be. And then what's happening here to the brain? The brain is now a bit insulin resistant, so it's not getting adequate fuel. So how may that manifest? Like
Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's, possibly, actually, yes. But what? On a day-to-day level? Hungry and depressed and a bit mentally lethargic and blah, blah, blah. And the same in the muscles, okay? If they're not getting adequate fuel, it's a bit difficult to have energy. So you don't want this situation, do you? You know, if you're attempting to be healthy and, optimize your weight and well-being, you don't want to be in an insulin-resistant state. So maybe you need to think about not eating too much rubbish carbohydrate. We'll come on to that again in a moment. So here's another hormone that has some influence on weight, and it's leptin. So most of you will have heard of this. It's secreted by the fat cells. It goes to the brain. What does it do? Two main things. It suppresses appetite, and it stimulates the metabolism. That's fantastic. So we would like our leptin to be doing a good job wherever possible. However, from time to time in certain individuals, leptin won't function so well. This is called leptin resistance. At its core appears to be the process inflammation. What causes inflammation? Well, one thing that causes inflammation is spikes in blood sugar that come from eating what? Carbohydrate, okay, that's good. Okay, here's another thing. Where are we here? Okay. The other thing is that there is a little bit of evidence that when you eat carbohydrate, no, there's plenty of evidence that when you eat carbohydrate, triglycerides go up. But triglycerides, there's some evidence there that links them with the inability now of leptin to get through the blood-brain barrier into the brain where it exerts its effect. So that's probably not a good thing if that indeed happens. The other thing is that omega-6 fats, our sunflower oils and many of the fats that we find in processed and fast food are pro-inflammatory, and we don't want too much inflammation in the body because inflammation, specifically here in the brain and the hypothalamus, can be problematic for us, okay? Now, are there any other reasons why we shouldn't eat a calorie-reduced diet? Yes, here's one other reason, okay? It makes cortisol levels go up. Now, you must have cortisol in the body. Without it, it's very difficult to function properly, okay? And most people will be very fatigued. But too much cortisol is potentially a factor in obesity because it predisposes to fat gain, particularly around the middle, visceral fat in the abdomen and around the organs, for example. It also breaks down muscle, so you could end up, losing some muscle, gaining some fat, and Fred Hahn would not be very happy if you did that.